Buenas tardes a todas, a todos. Mi nombre es Giorgio Jackson, soy diputado por Revolución Democrática acá en el Congreso Nacional de Chile, y les quiero dar la bienvenida a este capítulo número 10 y el capítulo final de A Toda Marcha, Encuentros desde Casa, el cual es un ciclo de conversaciones virtuales sobre la coyuntura política en torno a diversos ámbitos que se han visto afectados en esta crisis sanitaria mundial por la pandemia del coronavirus. Esta es una iniciativa impulsada por Revolución Democrática en conjunto con la Fundación FES Chile. Y en esta oportunidad tenemos una gran invitada que ya la pueden ver en pantalla, y reflexionaremos sobre el momento histórico por el cual estamos atravesando como civilización, de la revolución tecnológica, del cambio climático y, como no, de la pandemia que estamos viviendo. Lo que queremos discutir es cómo interactúan los distintos agentes para poder encontrar soluciones a estos tremendos desafíos globales y el rol que el Estado o los estados tienen en ellos. ¿Qué hacer con el tremendo desempleo? ¿Cómo fomentar la innovación tecnológica y prevenir al mismo tiempo los riesgos de la automatización? ¿Qué hacer con la creciente deuda pública que tienen muchos países? ¿Cómo incluir la perspectiva feminista en el centro del modelo y el debate económico? ¿Cómo podrían impactar estos temas al proceso de democratización constituyente que estamos a puertas de tener en Chile? ¿Y en qué condiciones de autonomía o suficiencia estamos los países del sur global para este debate? O sea, vamos a hablar de muchas cosas interesantes, y para eso Mariana Mazzucato, que para quienes no la conocen, es una economista, profesora de la Economía de la Innovación y Valor Público en la UCL, University College London, en el Reino Unido. Primero te queremos dar las gracias por darte este espacio y te saludamos, Mariana.
Gracias, estoy muy feliz de estar aquí con ustedes.
Bueno, el formato de esta conversación, como lo convenimos con Mariana, va a ser que yo voy a hacerte las preguntas en español y tú vas a poder contestar en inglés para que pueda ser más fluido. Tenemos la suerte de que Mariana entiende perfectamente el español. Vamos a dividir en dos bloques y para iniciar la conversación y romper un poco el hielo, queríamos preguntarte cómo has vivido personalmente esta crisis, ¿ya? Porque esta crisis nos pega en la reflexión en torno al mundo, pero también nuestra posición frente al mundo nos hace reflexionar de una manera. ¿Cómo la has vivido tú, Mariana?
I think it's an excellent question. I wish everyone would begin with that question. So I live in London and I have 4 children. So the most immediate way I lived it was having 4 young teenagers at home, which is the recipe for disaster. No, I'm kidding. Which was also very wonderful in the sense that we had much more time together. But also, London is a very unequal city. Many of the friends of my children are in very disadvantaged positions in all sorts of ways that we don't have to go into, but just to say, not as lucky as we are. And I was extremely aware day after day just how this crisis was affecting people in extremely different ways who had different social economic conditions. And I think that's really been a very strong backdrop, you know, in our area here in Camden. Food banks not only were very active, but also in a crisis situation. They did not have enough food. Interestingly, I found out why, which is that it usually is people on lower incomes that donate to food banks. Rich people don't. And those people on lower incomes had no money, had no food to donate. And so really, I mean, just at that level, from the very tangible, concrete way of living, it really has been a crisis in every way. And of course, in developing countries, even more. Having said that, given that I also, in my day job, work a lot with different governments and policymakers and public institutions worldwide, it was also a period of real fervence of activity because our work through the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose that I run, I felt, and I still feel, that our work was more needed than ever, because it's not enough just to have public money sort of come in during this period. You need to structure it in particular ways to make sure it really benefits citizens. And so I've been on Zoom calls constantly. I've actually started to collect screenshots of them because they were also beautiful conversations, very intense. But so there was always that contrast of both, you know, more warmth at home in terms of a lot of family interaction, also fights and screamings, of course, but also the very daily situation on the street, but also professionally a moment of need. And so feeling useful is always, I guess, a good thing.
Bueno,
Sorry for the long answer.
no te preocupes, está muy bien y creo que muchas veces son esas emociones que vivimos, esa desigualdad que se empieza a mostrar de una manera mucho más clara, más nítida, cuando esta pandemia ha llegado a los países y devela las desigualdades y las muestra. Creo que también nos hace sentir un poco más empáticos frente al sufrimiento ajeno. ¿Y cómo crees que ese temor frente a la incertidumbre, frente a la posible muerte y la enfermedad, ha permitido crear la empatía necesaria para repensar el rol del Estado, el rol de las instituciones? Se decía, leí en un artículo que en Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, que hay todo un debate respecto al tema de la salud y ha girado el apoyo de la opinión pública hacia mayor protección del Estado en materias de salud. ¿Cómo ves tú que se enfrenta desde la empatía, desde las emociones, ese cambio de mentalidad?
So I think that's also a very good point. I mean, definitely, and I've seen this on the news and on social media that worldwide in different cities, there was, people became closer together. There was more empathy, as you say, clapping in the streets, especially for the healthcare workers who were risking their lives. They were on the front line of this battle and still are. And on the one hand, that's wonderful. We all become more human. We remember what it means to take care of each other. We are only as healthy as our neighbor is with any pandemic, globally as well. Had this pandemic begun in a country that was not China, but perhaps a country in Africa with a much weaker health system, we would all globally have been worse off. So it's just a fact of any pandemic that also just technically, it also brings us more together in order to fight it. However, I think there's a risk that if we are just clapping, and if these demonstrations of empathy don't really transform the structures and the systems that caused the pandemic, or at least that also made it worse than it had to be, then it's almost an insult. That empathy itself can almost become an insult. I mean, in fact, here, the NHS workers of the National Health Service have started to say that, stop clapping and start funding, resource it, but also reimagine the welfare state. Why we need a strong, resilient, welfare state is, also goes beyond just throwing money at it, which we should also do, because at least in the UK, it's actually been starved in the last 10 years. But we need to remember why we have a welfare state and why we're lucky we have one. Many countries don't, by the way. So why every country needs a welfare state, but also, again, to be imaginative about it. We can bring, new design thinking to how we plan. The planning system itself requires a new level of imagination and creativity, but this crisis requires that. And if all the trillions of dollars globally that have gone in during this crisis, in some ways, again, for empathy, because a lot of states did react very quickly because of the misery on the ground, if those funds don't transform our systems, that's a crime. We cannot afford to have another wave and still be so unprepared as we were in the first wave. And so in that sense, we need to transform empathy to structural change.
En acción y cambio. Exacto. Tal cual, si no, lo más probable es que el acto de aplaudir, como tú mencionas, sea un acto de hipocresía o de doble estándar y no de transformación y conciencia hacia el futuro. Ahora, moviéndonos ya más a una fase histórica, ¿crees tú que los efectos de esta crisis son comparables con algún otro evento de la historia? Muchos han hablado ahora del tema de un Green New Deal por el cambio climático, pero también agravado por la pandemia, haciendo referencia al New Deal que se hizo en Estados Unidos a fines de los 20 en Estados Unidos, y probablemente también hay algunas similitudes, si bien la crisis es de completa otra dimensión que la crisis del 2008, la crisis financiera, esta es más bien una crisis sanitaria y de economía real. ¿Cómo ves tú, qué lecciones podemos sacar de la historia de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, o a qué evento histórico te evoca esta pandemia y qué lecciones podemos sacar de ahí?
So, I mean, even if we just stop at the word crisis, this crisis is not the only crisis that we're currently, if we just look at the today that we're currently living through, we are also living at the same time a climate crisis and still an economic crisis. Many many countries, even pre-COVID, were still getting over the ramifications of the 2008 financial crisis. The productive economy, the real economy, didn't get back on its feet in many parts, for example, of Southern Europe. And that's also because even before the financial crisis, those parts of Southern Europe were, already problematic, with productivity levels in Italy not having risen basically for the last 20 years. I mention Italy because I am Italian. So again, coming back to the personal. And so, again, I think it's very important to be careful when we compare crises, both the current ones we're living through and then looking back, to really unpick the details. And so, you mentioned both the New Deal and the financial crisis. And let me just say something about those two, and then we can, go broader. So first of all, with the financial crisis, there was, again, trillions globally that were put into the system to save basically capitalism from falling apart. And unfortunately, the structures of that funding was not adequate. In fact, a lot of that finance ended up back into the financial sector, literally. In the UK, still today, actually, a lot of the finance that's put into the system ends up in finance, insurance, and real estate. Something like 80% of the funds end up back in finance. So we can say finance is finance. And the bailouts that occurred then in the US, but also globally, there was no real strings attached. So companies like Goldman Sachs, which was bailed out by the US taxpayer for $10 billion, those risks were socialized. But then when the company very soon began to make record level profits, the profits were privatized. So this dysfunctional way in which public money goes into the system when there's a crisis, we absolutely have to learn from that. We cannot do that again. And I do find some optimism in the sense that this time around, I think there has been at least a lot of discussion about that, how to avoid that useless way to recover, because then it's not a proper recovery. It's just bailing out the banks, bailing out companies, no? And so, for example, there's been in countries like France, Macron himself said, we're not here to save industry, simply bailing it out. We're here to transform it. So there was very strong conditions that France placed on companies like Renault, the car manufacturer, or airlines like Air France, that they had to reduce their carbon emissions in order to access the bailout. Similarly, that happened in Denmark, also in Austria. So that's quite new. I mean, at least in my lifetime, I don't remember such a strong conversation. Even in the Financial Times, there was discussions about this. Similarly, in Denmark, there was a discussion, actually there's legislation, that companies that use tax havens are not eligible for the bailouts that are, the COVID bailouts. So again, getting, the structures to be right so that the recovery is more inclusive, it's more sustainable, is fundamental. And that doesn't mean, by the way, delaying the help that's given to the companies. You can still give, the help today, but the contracts that are there, because there's always a contract, no one just gets money thrown through the window. There's always some level of contract. The contracts really have to be transparent and clear on what the give and take is, that it's not just a handout, it's not just a bailout, a giveaway, but it's a relationship. And so when the state gives you money, what you want back is a commitment towards actually transforming your company to have a better corporate governance structure, or an investment plan that helps the country move towards its ambitions, if it's hopefully in a country that has ambitions, for example, around climate change. Similarly, actually, at a more regional level, in Europe, there's this very large European recovery fund called Next Generation EU. And for the first time in history, in some ways, since the beginning of the European Union, the conditions attached to the European Commission's funding going directly to member states has been conditional, not on deficit cutting, the famous troika conditions, cut your deficit, et cetera, but on the countries actually having a plan around climate and digitalization and also health. And so, for example, I'm currently an advisor for the Italian Prime Minister, and I'm with my team trying to help them not only come up with that plan, but also provide a framing through which the different investments that the different ministries might be interested in making aren't just a big shopping list, but can actually be, you know, framed into something where the sum, you know, the summation is bigger than the parts. So actually a plan of transformation for the country itself towards sustainability, digitalization, and stronger health systems. So again, this is a unique moment, and in that way, it is a bit like the New Deal. It does feel that, you know, attached to a crisis, the recovery is trying to create a stronger, more resilient economy. The problem is that the reality on the ground is that many countries just don't have the capabilities, the capacity, the implementation power, because there's been so much outsourcing from public administrations in terms of literally what we call the dynamic capabilities of the public sector, that, you know, it's easier said than done to come up with a plan. If you have spent the last 10 years outsourcing your plan to the consulting companies, Deloitte, you know, PwC, KPMG, you need to rediscover what it means even to have a plan. And at that level, I find it, again, I don't want to say encouraging, because again, it is a battle, but interesting and important that countries get very specific in this moment. So for example, procurement, you know, the budget that any ministry might have for purchasing goods and services itself can be a funnel of innovation and an investment, especially around the immediate, around the health services, right? Which are not just hospitals, but all the different ways of thinking of the social infrastructure related to health and care, which is distributed and decentralized across different organizations, including care homes, using the procurement power of, say, a health ministry to really not only solve the immediate problem, but to create a stronger health system and an innovative one, so that innovation and investment occurs through the procurement design itself is something I think very important to do now, because we can't just keep fixing little bits of the problem. We need to really, again, as I said in the beginning, invest in much better infrastructure and stronger capabilities and better designed policy instruments. And then, you know, we should remember that just before COVID, at least many countries were in fact talking about the Green Deal, the Green New Deal. And that's a very useful concept through which actually to be designing, again, these recovery plans, so that at least there's a vision for change. And in that sense, again, I think some countries are using that as an opportunity, and others perhaps aren't, and they're squandering. And so I think the more we can have conversations like this, but especially between politicians and funders, you know, the financing that is coming or that is required. Again, if I look at the European funds, which include through the European Investment Bank, the Next Generation EU program, they have to be very well structured to be conditional on these Green New Deal plans and actually creating a vision and a set of constraints through which the finance flows.
Bueno, de hecho, acá en Chile ha estado ese debate presente. Lo hemos tratado de impulsar para que, como tú bien dices, esta recuperación implique también una misión, una orientación hacia la transformación tecnológica, verde, etc. Y lamentablemente, a veces las respuestas de las recetas neoliberales para superar una crisis, lamentablemente no tienen contrapeso. Y acá en Chile, probablemente lo sabes, tenemos un gobierno de derecha y cuya como motivación económica hoy día es recuperar empleos por sobre cualquier cosa y a cualquier costo. Y eso es una receta muy antigua y es muy difícil de combatir en el debate público cuando ellos dicen, le meten un poco de keynesianismo, algo de keynesianismo, pero construyendo, de repente hasta subsidiando industrias que tienen combustibles fósiles o construyendo de repente caminos y no necesariamente generándole más capacidades y valor a la economía. Y toda la justificación es, necesitamos que haya más inversión, necesitamos que haya más, pero inversión cualquiera, bienvenida. Y yo al menos desde el Congreso y varias personas más también hemos levantado la necesidad de que, por ejemplo, si es que va a haber una reducción de impuestos algún momento, por algún periodo de tiempo, que no sea a las que tengan combustibles fósiles. o que sea a las que innovan y tratan de hacer algo distinto, que tengan equidad de género, algunos criterios que puedan orientar esa inversión y muchas veces rebotamos, o sea, no, chocamos contra una pared neoliberal que dice, acá la receta es una sola, inversión necesitamos y para eso hay que dar incentivos y como tú bien dices, finalmente eso no tiene necesariamente en el mediano y largo plazo un retorno para toda la sociedad, sino que simplemente estamos todas y todos pagando a través de exenciones tributarias o subsidios empresas que se quedan ahí, se quedan sin mecanismos de transformación. Y eso produce mucha impotencia. ¿Qué le dirías tú con qué argumentos convencerías a quienes dicen que hay simplemente que entregar incentivos ahora para generar los empleos lo más rápido posible y a cualquier costo?
I think I'll answer your question in two ways. First, directly at your question of what I would respond to those who say that all we need to do is, give money to the companies to make sure they get their profits again. But I would also like to make a provocation to the center left, which I obviously feel more in tune with, and to progressive governments really worldwide, which in many ways have failed, I think, as well to address the challenge that we have, not just with COVID, but just in what is the progressive agenda. So I want to get to that point because it's too easy to, go back to, there's the neoliberals and there's the left and somehow, there's this never-ending dichotomy. I think both need to wake up. So first on your question, which is basically what I was saying before, that in many countries, for sure in Chile, for sure in Italy, also in the UK where I live, the real problem has actually been inertia in the private sector for many years. There's actually been lagging investment, not lagging profits, by the way. The profit share of GDP globally is at a record level. There's been many different types of kind of regressive taxation policies that have increased profits. There have been financialized practices in many companies, excessive use of dividend payouts, share buybacks. $4 trillion been used just to buy back shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay in the last 10 years by the Fortune 500 companies. So these value extraction practices, but also not very smart government policies around, say, deregulation and taxation have increased profits and not increased investment. And it's investment that we need for long-run growth, and also for long-run sustainable and inclusive growth, we need a particular type of investment, not just invest in anything and hope for the best. So those conditionalities that I was talking about in terms of making sure that businesses invest, so not using tax havens, the example I gave, invest in green transformations of their sector, so lowering the material content of the steel sector. That, by the way, was a condition that occurred in Germany pre-COVID when the KfW helped the steel sector. They insisted they reduce their material content, which they did to repurpose, reuse, recycle. All these kinds of conditions are actually good for the country because they require investment, right? Which means jobs, which means innovation, which means investing in technology or diffusion of existing technology, full deployment of, digitalization, ICT, and green technologies. We always need to remember that it's not just innovation, it's diffusion of existing technology that matters, and that itself requires investment. When those conditions aren't there, it doesn't actually happen. Unfortunately, because there's lots of risk averseness, but also just inertia. Many companies might just be happy with the status quo, and why not just get another handout? So it shouldn't be seen as a left-wing agenda to talk about investment. It's actually about creating, more future growth opportunities for different types of companies, small, medium, and large, in new areas that don't exist now. So that transformative power, which also increases employment. So in that sense, we should remember that business investment is basically a function of the expectations by the business community of where future opportunities are. So the role of government is not to increase profits, but to increase the expectations of those opportunities by actually financing the harder bit, those areas that are more capital intensive, that have higher risk, more uncertainty. Not because we like uncertainty for the sake of uncertainty, but because often the early stage of a transformation, for example, of a green transformation of a country, will have more uncertainty by definition. And so it's important for the public sector to lead the way, not because we only want the public sector, but in order to crowd in, this is an ugly economics word, crowd in. I say ugly because it sounds negative. It's supposed to be positive. Crowd in the business sector. Now, unfortunately, in many countries, including in Chile, I think the progressives, so ourselves, have not spoken enough about this. There's been too much emphasis on redistribution, which is very important, by the way. I don't say throw out redistribution, just it cannot be the only conversation. We need to talk just as much about wealth creation, not just about wealth distribution. And that also means really thinking through the details. So we need to not just have lists of sectors, for example, whether, in Chile, copper and salmon and all sorts of different commodities and in terms of the export model, those very commodities should actually be transformed and enhanced with technology. So, not just furniture, but special wood projects, for example, products, for special uses. I mean, any sector can transform itself. That example I just gave of steel, the steel sector is not a sexy sector, but it can become greener by implementing an innovative strategy of repurpose, reuse, recycle, again, to lower its material content. There, in that sense, the sector itself its transformation becomes an input towards a transformation of a country, as opposed to a static sector in and of itself remaining how it is. And I think it's very important to make sure that our progressive agenda is incorporating this idea of science, technology, innovation, diffusion, deployment as a key way through which we increase wealth creation in a country, but not in a deterministic techno kind of way. It's also about bringing citizens to the table, bringing stakeholders to the table, including trade unions, for example, to first of all imagine what kind of society do we want to live in? What do we mean by a carbon neutral city? What is a sustainable growth agenda? What is the Green Deal? And get as many voices as we can ex ante to the table. That itself, I think, is very important in a progressive agenda. But it has to be also about investment, transformation, and innovation. And this is, by the way, one of the things I've been dedicating a lot of my time to in the last almost 10 years, which recently in Europe, again, I was very happy it became part of the European policy, this idea that I wrote about, which was about having mission-oriented policy, and those very missions addressing the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the most progressive agenda, 17 goals, which have to do with climate, inequality, hunger, etc. But they're too broad to really create an investment pathway. They're very important in terms of the vision. The vision is necessary. 17 goals. There's 169 targets beneath them, but there's something in the middle, which is like the moonshots, right? So in Europe, we talked about having 100 carbon neutral cities by 2030, and that really required having an investment and an industrial strategy around energy, mobility, real estate, construction materials, food, the social sector. But then again, what it required was also a transformation of existing government tools, grants, loans, procurement, from being these static kind of handout machines to being actually catalyzers of bottom-up experimentation to actually find solutions towards different goals. Similarly, you could look at different missions around aging for those countries that have demographic challenges like Japan and Italy. You could have, of course, all sorts of different missions around the healthcare problem. The vaccine itself could become a mission if it's framed in a much more ambitious way. If we say that we want to have a vaccine that's universally accessible, that's already very different from just saying you want to race for a vaccine, right? So to make sure it's actually universally available and accessible by everyone, which is the only, point of having a vaccine, because we're not going to be vaccinated if half the people in the world aren't, then that means you need to govern that process in a particular way with really strong notions of the public good and the common good and the commons. Sorry.
Sí, vamos a volver a ese punto después cuando hablemos, te queríamos preguntar también sobre temas relacionados a estados que tengan misiones, ¿no? Que estén orientados a alguna misión, sobre todo porque vamos a tener un proceso constituyente acá en Chile, vamos a discutir sobre una nueva constitución, pero antes hay una pregunta y un tema que cuando publicamos que íbamos a tener esta conversación contigo, nos llegó mucho, porque tú has mencionado y has escrito respecto a la triple crisis que enfrenta el capitalismo, pero el confinamiento de la pandemia ha puesto en evidencia la importancia de los cuidados. Tú partiste, de hecho, hablando de eso en tu situación en tu casa, ¿no? Y son labores que históricamente han sido realizadas por mujeres, madres, abuelas, hermanas, pero ahora, dada la imposibilidad de salir de casa, ha sido una red muy difícil de activar para muchas de ellas. ¿Consideras que se podría sumar a estas crisis la crisis de los cuidados como una cuarta crisis del capitalismo, en el fondo, que las sociedades patriarcales han enfrentado el creciente empuje de tener que reconocer hoy, mucho más que antes, con mucho más conciencia, la labor reproductiva y la labor de cuidados que ejercen las mujeres, y que eso finalmente el capitalismo siempre lo delegó como si fuese gratuito, ¿no? Como si fuese un trabajo gratuito de las mujeres, y hoy día hay más conciencia respecto a la crisis de un trabajo que no se está remunerando, pero que es uno de los principales creadores de valor.
Yes, it's a very important point. And again, if we don't wake up to that point now, I don't know when we will, because the crisis has really highlighted how important care is and how little prepared we are to confront the tremendous caring structure that we need and don't have. So women for a long time in many different countries have been the main carers, and feminist economists have for a long time been writing about this problem. So it's nothing new, right? The fact that we confuse price with value. I've written about this in my book called The Value of Everything, El Valor de Todo. I think the translation.
El valor de las cosas.
Ah, sí, that's true. I wonder why yeah, it's interesting, huh?
Es el que me pasaste tú.
Okay, sí, qué bien. I wrote about it in my book that when we confuse price with value, there's no better way to see the result of that dysfunction than with care. Because we only know how to look at the cost of care, for example, right? So when you have a public health system, you will have the cost of the nurses, the cost of different types of care, but we don't know how to value in countries that also have a free public health system, like in the UK with the National Health Service, the value that produces. So you will have this weird situation where, Lloyd Blankfein, 1 year after the financial crisis, he was the head of Goldman Sachs, said that Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. Now, he's right. How we measure productivity and how we measure output and how we measure value in our economy means that Goldman Sachs workers who earn the most are the most productive, right? Because productivity is output per labor. So if we don't know how to measure the value of the output, for example, of a well-structured public health system, and we only know how to look at the costs, then by definition, so the inputs, right, the salaries of the nurses, for example, then by definition, we will always be only talking about how much it costs, the public spending, and how we need to make it more efficient or maybe cut it, because we don't actually know how to evaluate the benefits that society has when you have a well-structured, well-resourced public education system, public health system, public transport system. The public is undervalued. Now, and that's even when we're paying for the care, right? So we're paying for nurses. Obviously, they're not doing it for free. Now, in a home, most of the care that's done, whether it's care for children, care for the elderly, care for the home itself to be a nice place for everyone to feel happy and be fed, is, often not paid for. And so there you have, an even bigger problem. The input is not cared for. And so I do think that, both the fact that the crisis fell especially on women, also because when you had the lockdown, which unfortunately we may very well have again in many different countries, and the kids were at home, that impacted especially the women who then had to stay at home, not just because of the lockdown, but to take care and to look after the children. That's just a fact. We know it did affect them more, which obviously affects them also more in terms of their, relationships in the job, because we don't actually, again, value that care. And so that might create tensions for, anyway, this is all problems that I don't have to rehearse. We know them. There's many wonderful writings by feminists for a century about this problem. The real question is, what do we do about it now? Will we actually wake up that this now needs to be solved in all sorts of ways, both in terms of making sure that in moments like this, it's not just the woman who has to do the extra. So the same kind of arguments for paternity leave that you have when, people have children, we should be thinking in terms of, who's actually... Yeah, paternity leave during a crisis, so that it's not just the woman who has to, be overly relied on. But I think the bigger question right now is to break down what we mean by having not just a Green Deal, but a healthy, caring Green Deal. And really look at the investments, the innovation, the social infrastructure that's required, but also, again, the new social compact that we have, both in the home between the man and the woman, but especially between the state in terms of the help it's providing to businesses and the kind of work structures that have to be obviously much more flexible to allow for people to be able to, even deal with a crisis of this kind. And I don't know, I mean, maybe you can tell me in Chile if you have some great ideas of how one can do this, but the biggest problem is that in a moment like this, there's such emergency measures that everyone worries about, that the kind of more granular details, like what we're talking about now, get sort of shoved to the side. And I think it's very important that we don't do that, that these kinds of questions about care and about women's work and the social compact at work be brought to the table in terms of how we recover and how the same contracts that we were talking about before are structured.
Sin duda, la pandemia ha generado mucho más conciencia respecto a los cuidados y los cuidados domésticos, lo que tenemos que hacer en nuestras casas. Se ha repartido de una manera como nunca antes, al estar todos confinados, las responsabilidades entre hombres y mujeres, y yo creo que eso ha generado mucho más conciencia. Y creo que uno de los riesgos, porque como tú bien dices, hay muchas economistas feministas que han escrito sobre esto, y también cientistas políticas, sociólogas, etcétera. Creo que uno de los riesgos es que si es que se le pusiera precio, por así decirlo, a cada una de esas labores, se terminarían mercantilizando a todas las relaciones sociales. O sea, es decir, se mercantilizarían más, ¿no? Y hay un riesgo, hay una tensión que quizás podría resolverse, y esto es algo que yo también leí, más bien con un salario básico universal, un basic income, ¿no? Porque ahí estás reconociendo socialmente que todos están aportando sin necesariamente medir cada transacción y ponerle valor a cada una de las transacciones de los cuidados, etc. Así que ahí puede haber una pista. Pero te quería llevar a un segundo bloque porque el tiempo va avanzando y queremos aprovechar todo el tiempo que tenemos contigo para movernos a Chile. Ya este segundo bloque queremos contarte, probablemente lo has escuchado, que Chile, después de las movilizaciones de octubre del año pasado, va a tener un plebiscito para poder tener una nueva constitución, ¿no? Eso es el 25 de octubre. Y la constitución actual, la que tenemos, es herencia de la dictadura, ¿no? Que Chile fue un experimento neoliberal, probablemente, y bien lo sabes, y cuyo modelo contrasta mucho con lo que tú en tu primer libro bestseller, El Estado Emprendedor, señalas, ¿no? Acá es todo lo contrario, es un Estado y un modelo subsidiario en el cual ojalá todo lo hagan los privados, y solo si es que los privados no logran hacerlo, el Estado llega con una solución muchas veces outsourced también, ¿no? Como incluso externalizada. ¿Cómo ves tú esta oportunidad que a mis ojos parece la ocasión perfecta para imaginar y decidir democrática una nueva forma de organizar las instituciones en torno a misiones y propósitos, sin tener que cargar muchas veces con la tradición constitucional que tenga un país, porque vamos a partir desde una hoja en blanco, ¿no? Y por lo tanto vamos a poder recoger aquellas cosas que nos gusten, pero también eliminar aquellas cosas que no nos gusten, como quizás otros países no tienen la oportunidad. Pensemos en la segunda enmienda en Estados Unidos con el tema de las armas, ¿no? que no tienen muchas posibilidades políticas de eliminarla. ¿Cuáles, según tu punto de vista, debieran ser esos propósitos o misiones básicas en el año 2021? Cualquier país que tuviera la oportunidad de tener un proceso constituyente. Ha cambiado mucho el Internet, la revolución tecnológica, el tema climático. ¿Cuáles para ti serían, si es que tú estuvieras en un proceso constituyente en tu país, cuáles son las cosas que dirías son los núcleos fundamentales de un Estado para el siglo XXI?
Wow. That's, I mean, it's a great opportunity, isn't it, to be able to, in theory at least, treat it as a tabula rasa. You know, let's start again. What should our, constitution look like, and what are the basic principles? I mean, it's interesting. The Italian constitution begins saying that Italy is founded on work. And I really like that first sentence. It's one of the few, I don't know any other constitution that begins like that, but you would think that a country that is founded on work, il lavoro, would then really work hard towards making sure that working conditions are really good and that we value the work of all, the care work, as we were talking about before. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen in Italy. And so I think it's very important in any moment like this that you're talking about to make sure that you both have very important words, but then the right mechanisms to hold those words to account, to also have targets, but also metrics and checks and balances. Are we actually just bullshitting, or are we moving the society, the economy, or our social fabric in such a way that makes us all better off and builds a more resilient, inclusive, again, and sustainable society? So I think, given that you're going through this in 2020, 5 years after the SDGs have been agreed on globally, and Chile, of course, is one of the countries that signed up to them, I think it'd be really interesting to begin very clearly in saying that Chile is going to have a plan, is both going to respect the Sustainable Development Goals, but actually make them land in Chile in a very concrete way, in its full territory, from north to south, east to west, in a very practical way, with real citizen engagement. And so breaking down those goals, which I really think every country should do this, because we've never had this historically in capitalism or in the history of humanity, that every country, basically almost every country, signed up to 17, really ambitious goals, which have to do with human rights. Before, when you were talking about care, I wanted to say, but then we moved on to another topic, that we should really start thinking about care and caring as a human right, not just, an activity that we need to value better or not. And then what does that mean? And the economy of human rights, we have no idea how to talk about that. We just talk about, at best, public goods. Anyway, so coming back to the SDGs, I do think they are human rights, but there are also investment plans that are required, to access them. But also it's about participation. And again, citizen engagement, stakeholder capitalism. So I think maybe those three things, making Chile use the Sustainable Development Goals to restructure its society and its economy. 2, really take that process seriously through its industrial strategy, its innovation policy, but to have the two, in conversation with each other in a very strict way. But 3, reinvent the participatory kind of democratic processes at the very local level, citizen assemblies, every street, every neighborhood, of course, every city, the regions, of course, need different levels of this participatory process. But there's a real importance, I think, to reinvent democracy in an era where globally, I think populism is taking hold and is fueling the fire by making citizens think, oh, all the politicians, they're all corrupt anyway. Politics doesn't matter. Don't vote. Let's just have kind of anarchy. Like in Italy, there was a particular party, Il Movimento di Cinque Stelle, the 5-star movement, I think, that unfortunately kind of took that line. It was too anti-state in a moment where we need the state more than ever, but a new state, new structures, not the old state, a new state. But if you no longer believe in our parliamentary processes or even in trade unions and the important intermediating effect that they have to, but even there we need to reinvent the trade union. We need to reinvent the labor's voice, but it doesn't mean to be, anti-union, to see these as too corporatist, because we need to reinvent the structures at the same time that we support them in terms of why they're there. We will not work if we're all atomistic. So I think participatory structures, SDGs, and transforming innovation and industrial strategies in such a way that are in immediate dialogue with these big social goals around climate, around health, around digitalization. And by digitalization, we shouldn't fool ourselves. This is not about, just get a computer in every office and every home and strong broadband. It's actually about being able to really also defend in a proactive way citizens around their data, seeing data itself as a human right, but also giving cities the opportunity to really improve their public transport systems with the data that is created every time you click on Citymapper. That requires a very different kind of flow of information and also new governance and ownership structures so that the public, meaning the citizens, really benefit from what is basically the new general purpose technology.
Sin duda. Y antes de que esto vaya terminando, tenemos 2 o 3 preguntas más que creo que sumando las amenazas tecnológicas, tú mencionabas el tema de la privacidad, también se viene el tema de la automatización cada día con más fuerza, las amenazas sanitarias, la pandemia, la salud mental, que también es un problema creciente, las amenazas culturales como el racismo, como la xenofobia también, producto de la migración y de los flujos migratorios, y obviamente las amenazas socioeconómicas, desigualdad, pobreza en términos de género, además de la climática. Se ve bien pesimista, o uno podría pensar que hay muchas amenazas dando vuelta, y están cruzadas estas amenazas con los impulsos del capital, y lo que fría y eufemísticamente se conocen como las externalidades negativas. ¿Es posible conciliar la dignidad de la vida y la armonía del planeta en el marco del capitalismo? Tú has hablado de corregir el capitalismo muchas veces, ¿no? To fix it. ¿Es posible arreglarlo o inherentemente trae un choque que hace muy difícil pensar en que se puede arreglar el capitalismo y hay que hablar más de el postcapitalismo o de una forma nueva de socialismo democrático? ¿Cómo lo ves tú esa tensión?
So first of all, I never use the word fix ever because I hate it. You can't fix your way out of anything. If I fix, I have a leak in the house, if I just fix the house and the leak and not understand why the leak is there, it's going to leak again. So I do want to say that because I don't think I said it so far. In economics, at least, the theory of how markets work and how capitalism works, it's very problematic because the idea of the existence of the state in traditional economic theory, which, by the way, informs every policymaker worldwide. So this is practice, it's not just philosophy. It's all about fixing market failures. The idea is that you have to, wait for the market to mess up, either due to a positive externality or a negative externality, and then the state comes in either through an investment, say in research and development, positive externality, a carbon tax, negative externality, and you just start putting all these patches and band-aids in the system and hope for the best. So that doesn't work. Now, your bigger question is, why are we even talking about markets? Because my critique is we should be co-creating and co-shaping markets to deliver inclusive and sustainable growth. And your question now, one could interpret it as saying, fine, but why talk about co-creating, co-shaping markets? Why don't we actually create a different type of economy that's not based, say, on the market mechanism? I think it's a very valid question. I think, however, there's sometimes a misunderstanding. So when I talk about markets, I think of markets as not just about capitalism. Markets are the outcome of how public, private, third sector, social movements come together and how they are structured and how they interact one with the other. The result of that gives us a particular type of economy, and within that, a particular type of market structure. There's nothing that would say that if you radically transform the state to be much more participatory, less top-down, much more mission-oriented, the private sector to be less driven by shareholder value, much more by stakeholder value with trade unions on the board of companies, etc. to have social movements, so student movements, green movements at the center of the process of planning, not just on the periphery, always defending themselves, like the just transition globally is a defense by the trade unions saying, hey, when we move towards a greener society, we need to make sure we're investing in workers along the way or they get left behind. Okay, fine. But why do you have to just defend yourself? You should be at the table ex ante, not just ex post, defining, again, the green transition. So if we have a fundamentally new social compact, citizen assemblies where these, what kind of city do we want to live in is discussed with the citizens. It's not handed down by people like me, the expert or the politician and the business. Yeah. So a real citizen assembly, a transformation of corporate governance, a transformation of the state to be, first of all, more capable because less outsourcing, but also more citizen focused, outcomes focused, mission oriented to solve the biggest challenges of our time. Will that still be what you think capitalism is? I don't know, but I think putting labels, putting labels, I think historically has stopped us. People post-capitalism, unfortunately, the people who've written about it haven't always been on the ground enough working with some of the, people, again, on the front lines, whether it's a city mayor, the civil servants and departments. You need to get your hands very dirty to believe that we can change.
Entiendo tu punto y la provocación. Es muy interesante ese debate y seguro que los distintos movimientos progresistas tienen ese debate recurrentemente, pero hay que gobernar también. Y en ese ejercicio hay que ir viendo probablemente cómo interactúan los agentes, como tú dices, y cómo se generan los check and balance también para ir mejorando y apuntando al bienestar de las personas. No me quiero quedar sin preguntarte algo que para nosotros desde el sur es muy importante, ¿no? La categoría de sur global desde la CEPAL en los años 70 empezó a influenciar un debate que viene a desafiar la historia de la intelectualidad eurocéntrica o desarrollada, ¿no? Y por lo tanto, por distintas razones, los países pobres o en vías de desarrollo no tienen las mismas posibilidades de generar las capacidades productivas innovadoras y complejas como lo pueden tener en el norte global, ¿no? Por distintos mecanismos, incluidos el acceso al conocimiento, a las patentes, y por lo tanto, cómo desencadena eso en el know-how, ¿no? No solamente en el knowledge, sino también en el know-how. ¿Cómo incorporar la división sur-norte, centro-periferia, en tu análisis de la creación de valor? ¿Pueden las comunidades del sur global conseguir bienestar y autonomía a la vez en los momentos que estamos viviendo, sobre todo con la pandemia, el acceso a la vacuna, a las medicinas, con las grandes tecnológicas, viendo todo lo que hacemos en nuestros teléfonos, con una capacidad de inteligencia mucho más allá de lo que nos podemos imaginar? ¿Cómo se piensa en la esperanza? Que es lo que, como tú finalizas tu libro, ¿no? Como la economía de la esperanza. ¿Cómo los países del sur global, en esta situación tan adversa, pueden pensar en esperanza?
So again, fantastic questions. I'm so glad this is recorded, isn't it? Sometimes you have a great conversation with someone over dinner and you say, oh, I wish it was recorded. So I'm glad you're recording this because your questions are fantastic. I don't know about my answers. So it's a central question, and I'm going to say something maybe a bit provocative, which is, I think, at least from my experience, and maybe my experience is too, again, practical, I think the South-North distinction is sometimes not very useful because within the South, just look at Latin America, there are so many differences between the countries. And often those differences have had to do with the political situation, as you began by saying that Chile currently has a particular type of vision or lack of vision, or particular type of a political party and economic kind of analysis of what needs to be done, which is different from other moments in Chilean history. But also, if you look across Latin America, there are some countries that have certain types of organizations and institutions that other countries don't have. So I worked for a long time in Brazil before Bolsonaro, for example, with people working inside the public bank, BNDES, which itself has had a long history, and it's gone through a big transformation over time. And that kind of institution, just as an example, there's other institutions we can look at. So a public bank offering patient long-term finance, and in a way that's also innovative. So not just about infrastructure and the capital development of the economy, as important as that is, but increasingly, again, also with an innovation lens and a transformation lens. That doesn't exist all over Latin America. Yeah. Mm. So I often found even the concept, for example, that my friend Jim O'Neill at Goldman Sachs came up with, the BRICS, right? It made no sense. Those 4 countries, or how many? BRICS? 5 countries. 5. Sorry. I have to count them. I'm getting senile. Those 5 countries were very different one from another in terms of all sorts of things. Whether or not they had an industrial strategy, what type of industrial strategy did they have? What Chris Freeman would call any level of an innovation system, and again, the structures on the ground. So I think that's the real question, which is in the South of the world, but also we can just talk specifically now for a minute about Latin America. What do we know works? What doesn't work? Corfo in Chile, how is it structured? What is the current thinking behind it? How does it interact with other organizations in Chile? Is there an industrial strategy? Is that industrial strategy just a list of sectors like copper, and then you go back to the natural resource curse discussion or not? Or is there actually a transformation agenda where copper itself becomes an input towards, again, a green transformation?
Claro.
There's nothing about the South of it being a southern country that tells me, except the level of development, which just means all those conversations are much, much harder. And as you yourself said, it means that maybe the discussion is not so much about the technological frontier, but more about diffusion and deployment. But even that, it depends what we mean by technology and the frontier of the technology. Any sector can transform in the ways that I said before. The steel sector, an old, boring sector, can transform itself.
Déjame ahí refrasear la pregunta de otra manera, porque tiene que ver un poco con lo mismo. Porque muchas veces se trata de escala, ¿no? Por ejemplo, si es que acá en Chile, en nuestra economía, quisiéramos decidir autónomamente que vamos a tener una Corfo o una institución pública que vaya a cumplir tales objetivos, no tenemos cómo tener la escala suficiente para hacer lo que hace Estados Unidos o China, ¿no? O lo que hace Europa. ¿Cómo se asumen los desafíos dentro de los límites de un Estado-nación? Sobre todo si son países con menos ingresos, con menos capacidades instaladas. ¿Cómo se gobierna la tecnología? ¿Cómo se combate el cambio climático? ¿Cómo se enfrentan los fenómenos migratorios, la concentración económica? Si es que tú actúas desde el sur del mundo en un país que no tiene poder a escala global. Entonces, aquí hay un tema que desde la Organización Mundial del Comercio, que desde muchas organizaciones y estructuras a veces sirven más que para emancipar y liberar a los pueblos, pueden ser también barreras a la hora de asumir esos desafíos. Entonces, hay gobernanza para el comercio, pero no hay gobernanza para, por ejemplo, no sé, el tema ambiental o el tema tecnológico. ¿Cómo lo ves tú desde los países chicos, como que no tienen escala suficiente para curar el cáncer o para, no sé?
Yeah. So first of all, the missions I increasingly look at are not the big missions like cancer or the Cold War missions. I mean, the Apollo program to me is just interesting because it was done with so much experimentation, so many different sectors, and a public sector in a period in US history that was really investing in its own capabilities. All those things today, in some ways, you don't have today in the US as the public sector itself in the US, even in places like NASA, has really changed a lot, and there's a hemorrhage of talent away actually from those organizations. But let's forget the Apollo program. Your question is, a country. I mean, I think your question needs to be broken down into 2. One is the size of the country, which you said chico, grande, pequeño, and another is the level of development. So in Europe, there's a tiny country called Denmark, which is today the #1 provider of high-tech green services to China, which is a huge country, and China spending 1.7 trillion, that's 12 zeros, on greening its entire economy, including energy-friendly technologies. And a little country, Denmark, is servicing it because they invested in green services, right? So not big, Apollo structures, but all the, startups in Copenhagen were there, not just because they were startups with foolish startup policy and SME policy, which we often see, but these small companies were servicing strategies that Denmark had at the national and at the city level, and they scaled up, again, through mechanisms like procurement, and then they found themselves on the cutting edge of green services, which really any country can actually produce, but they don't come out of anywhere. They come out of a plan. They come out of a whole, cluster effects and skill generation and really kind of dynamic hubs that form in particular areas. And again, capital goes there because that's the cool place to be. I mean, again, we can go into how that works, but the point is, there's nothing about Chile that means that it wouldn't be able to, given its size and its level of development, to have that kind of spillover effect that if it wanted to, within Latin America and then globally, become a place that also invested in, all the services, again, that would be required to reinvent, the relationship between its own natural resources and a green transformation that it wants to undergo also for all the region of Latin America. You can imagine all sorts of incredibly interesting jobs and sectors and transformations of those sectors that would be needed in order for that to happen. So there's no real limit, in terms of the imagination. The question is, what do you have on the ground? And unfortunately, and this is where we need investment and change, the transformation, both on the private side, as we began in our conversation, but also the public side, is needed. So if there's no implementation capacity, lots of good ideas, but then it doesn't get implemented because of the problems we were mentioning before about outsourcing, then one of the first priorities of a country like Chile is to make sure that it has a plan for renewing, for making dynamic and creative its civil service. There are really interesting examples around the world of countries. Again, unfortunately, we always have to go to Scandinavia, but it's not only. In the UK, even, a country that has not been investing in its civil service. There was one agency called Government Digital Services that invested a lot in-house in changing how we thought about, again, government digital services. And through that, they ended up creating one of the most innovative public web platforms called gov.uk that won an international design award and became a place of learning for global civil servants who were thinking about what does it mean to put the user, the citizen as user, at the center of its web platform, as opposed to thinking of citizens as clients or customers. Very kind of advanced capitalism way of thinking of, students are clients of the school, a patient is a customer of the hospital. No, they're citizens with human rights and they're going to use that stuff. How do you transform those services with that citizen in mind? So, I mean, I think what you're asking is central, but it's too easy to then go and say, oh, this is just much easier for a large country. There's many large countries that are not innovative. There's many large countries that are not working for their citizens, that don't have a transformative, mission-oriented industrial strategy. I do think if we look at, Cuba, for example, in terms of what it was able to do in the health sector, just coming back to the COVID moment, and both developing technology, and technologically around areas like biotechnology, but also, being one of the only countries in Latin America that actually was able to provide very good healthcare for its citizens, even when it had the boycott, still does. So obviously incredibly challenging. That's the extreme case that you can say it doesn't have to actually do with the size, but the ambition, the will, and the transformation, both of the public sector itself and the transformation of, your industrial capacity. But that's not to say it's easy. This is all extremely hard, extremely hard. But the first thing I do think, given what you are doing there politically, is to make sure that the progressive agenda puts these issues at the center. And again, focusing, just as much on pre-distribution and value creation as on value redistribution, and rethinking industrial strategy, innovation policy to make that happen, but in the context of Chile, not in the context of the US or China, as you said.
Tal cual. Bueno, Mariana, no queremos abusar de tu tiempo. Nos habíamos comprometido a estar 1 hora y ya nos pasamos 4 minutos, así que te queremos agradecer en nombre de nuestro partido político por acompañarnos el día de hoy a esta sesión de cierre del ciclo de conversatorios y agradecemos también a quienes siguen esta transmisión también por nuestras redes sociales. Les comentamos que el video de este capítulo y los anteriores quedarán guardados tanto en el canal de YouTube como en el fanpage de Revolución Democrática y de A Toda Marcha, para que puedan revivir esta conversación en esta oportunidad cuando lo deseen, tal cual como decías, Mariana, después te vamos a mandar el link. Muchas gracias al equipo de Revolución Democrática que trabajó en esto y a la Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, la FES Chile, por coordinar esta importante iniciativa que contempló 10 sesiones de conversación, convocó a más de 20 invitados e invitadas de Chile, Latinoamérica y el mundo, a mis compañeros y compañeras de partido que asumieron obviamente este rol de moderación, y muchas gracias a todas y todos quienes siguieron los capítulos para este debate, como tú bien dices, que es muy necesario poner en común distintas reflexiones que nos permitan avanzar hacia la profundización de nuestra democracia, la justicia social y, por supuesto, la discusión pública. Cuídense mucho y hasta la próxima versión de A Toda Marcha. Gracias, Mariana.
Chao, chao. Gracias.